My name is Julia.
And I'm Sabrina.
And this is Trans Inside. So, for people who maybe haven't listened to our last episode, we are going to be discussing some difficult topics, a lot to do with discrimination, violence, including emotional, physical, sexual violence towards trans women in prisons. We really wanted to create this podcast for people who are working with gender diverse clients and maybe feeling overwhelmed by the experiences that their clients are letting them know about, the level of trauma, the level of just like lack of knowledge in other systems that they're encountering. Once again, my name is Julia, as I've said. I am a white queer person. I do not have specific experiences with incarceration, but I have worked in settings where I've worked with trans people and incarcerated folks.
And I'm Sabrina. I am also a white social work student at Carleton. I am a straight woman, and I have never had an experience inside prison myself. Only my experiences talking with people that have lived in prisons and have been involved in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, so our current podcast episode today, we're going to be talking about sort of the current situation and also what you can do as both on like a micro level and a sort of macro policy level. So getting right in, just to reiterate what placement actually looks like, which is quite different than what CSC, Correctional Services Canada, says is happening. So the vast majority are housed in institutions that correspond with their birth sex. The issue here being CSC policy. So the Human Rights Act was amended to show that it was against the Human Rights Act to discriminate based on the idea of gender identity. And so Correctional Services Canada, who's discriminating the house down, was like, well, what do we do now? They developed the Commissioner's Directive. The directive specifies that offenders will be placed in institutions according to their gender identity and expression based on their preference, regardless of their sex, including anatomy, or the gender sex marker on their ID cards. In the event there is an overriding health and safety concern that cannot be resolved, the offender will be placed in a site that is better aligns with their current sex, including anatomy. So just want to reiterate here that overriding health or safety concern, because we are finding out that it turns out most people are being placed under this.
Right. Well, when we think about people involved in the criminal justice system in Canada, and we're specifically talking about the federal system and Corrections Canada, there's one thing to say on paper that we will place people in prisons based on their gender identity, but there's this big asterisk of unless there's an overriding health or safety concern. I mean, I know that CSC, I believe, has developed a tool of some kind to determine this, but overall, it feels like a lot of things could fall into that category, especially if you're a prisoner. You already are considered to be an overriding health and safety concern.
Yeah, that's why you're in prison, according to them.
That's why you're in prison to begin with. So I mean, that seems like a big asterisk right there.
And again, to echo the thing we said last episode, according to the Westbrook and Schultz, like, the having of a penis is considered an overriding safety concern. The having a vagina is seen as an overriding health concern, putting you at risk of victimization. So it seems very easy for them to place everyone under this. And it's very opaque. It's hard for us to know.
We don't know. Right? I mean, the only things, like, these are things that feel like they're being kept from the public eye, right? I mean, I only know certain things because I've spoken with people that have been involved in the criminal justice system, and I'm sure that my knowledge is lacking in a lot of areas. But overall, this information isn't public, so it's so difficult to actually say what's going on in a prison setting, right?
Prison Legal Services in British Columbia says out of the 47 requests by gender diverse individuals for placement and transfer of the people that they see, only 7 were approved, 34 were denied, so that's 72% of requests, and 6 were withdrawn. So that's again we can be placed however that's not happening.
Right. And like we said earlier, I mean, 67% of trans women are in men's institutions based on Correctional Canada data, and 95% of trans men are in women's institutions. So it seems like, is this policy really being implemented in real life? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe to some extent, but there's definitely a lot of...
Certainly not enough.
A lot of people that are falling into this loophole.
Mm-hmm. And then the other sort of big thing that's happening here, can you tell us a bit about ID cards?
Yeah, so my understanding is in a prison setting, every incarcerated person has a prison identification card, and I believe they need to carry these with them when they're on parole and for various other reasons within the prison system. The thing about the prison ID cards, it being the primary form of identification that somebody has in a prison, right, where they have their other ID taken away from them, it doesn't matter what's on their on their driver's license or on their health card. What matters is CSC decides that unless you have this specific genitalia, there's this binary of male and female, and they refuse to change a person's sex designation in their electronic offender management system unless that person undergoes a gender-affirming bottom surgery, which means that the preoperative trans person's sex assigned at birth appears in the header of every official document relating to them, which effectively outs them to decision makers and exposes them to discrimination. Trans feminine people in men's institutions are also put into men's programming. CSC uses the fact that they haven't done appropriate programming to deny their transfer to women's institutions. And CSC routinely uses factors like a trans person's high mental health needs to deny them a transfer. All of this, despite the fact that Corrections Canada would never house a cisgender woman in a men's institutions for all these same reasons, no matter the health, safety, or programming concerns.
So through this, ID cards are very connected to placement.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about somebody having to every day see something that causes them dysphoria.
Yeah.
Right? And they can't change it unless they undergo this procedure, which is not a simple procedure. It can take many months to recover from and is quite intensive. It's a quite intensive surgery to have a bottom surgery. Mm-hmm. So it's not so simple, and then even accessing it is difficult. So it's frustrating that even though somebody has been out as a trans woman for many years, maybe is taking the steps to eventually have a gender affirming surgery, and maybe is taking hormones and is using a different name than their birth name, they still can't change their gender marker on their ID card, no matter all of these things.
Yeah, and then on top of that, it outs you to people, anyone who sees it, which leads us into being a trans person in prison right now is very dangerous. Correctional Services Canada admits they have no strategy for protecting vulnerable groups from sexual violence. One of the things they're currently trying is people are often sent to solitary protective custody and administrative segregation for their own protection. However, individuals who have been charged with a sexual offense are often also put in protective custody. This means that trans people are often put in the same vicinity as sexual offenders, which can increase their vulnerability to sexual violence. So in the same way that they're trying to protect people by taking them out of general population, they're being placed with people who are likely to offend against them. So there's sort of no escape, and then at the same time you have all the mental health concerns of solitary confinement.
Right, and even like CSC data that from 2022 where they did the study about gender diverse demographics in prison showed that many gender diverse individuals had an experience of intimate partner violence or childhood sexual assault. And then now you're further victimizing them by putting them in a setting where they're at risk.
Yeah. And so this sort of creates this, deciding to disclose and trying to seek placement that's hard to get, as we've established, is like a complex decision. Like trans men may choose not to self-disclose because at the same time they're in a women's facility and they're not a woman. Being placed in a men's facility might lead them to be placed in harm, so they might not choose to self-disclose. At the same time, I think we have this idea that women's prisons are, kind, soft environments where no violence happens, which is very much not the case based on people's experiences.
No, and I mean, in some ways, that's a stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's less women's institutions by
Certainly.
far
Yeah.
than men's. So perhaps there's somewhat more specific, like tailored care given to women. But overall, it doesn't mean that it's a safe setting or that it's, that much better than a men's prison. I think that's subjective.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, this is based on the idea of violence only coming from other incarcerated people. Whereas this again brings us to the idea of strip searches, cavity searches. Legal scholar Kyle Kirkup says that strip searches are part of a power imbalance where sexuality outside the norm is attacked. Trans prisoners can be strip searched and urine tested by guards of genders they do not feel comfortable being searched by, and this can be very humiliating and also physically harmful. This also creates this idea of trying to track violence, is that again there's not great data. There's a gap in the literature. Cis women and Indigenous persons are studied much more than other racialized groups or LGBTQ populations, so that again creates this thing where we have data on some stuff and not on other stuff, and it's hard to create this picture where you can understand what's happening and then intervene.
Right, and I mean, again, with the reporting challenges, right? Just how do you report an assault in prison? I mean, there's so many bureaucratic barriers to that.
And what if your assault is, your abuser is one of the guards?
Right.
Are you going to report that?
Right, and of course, Corrections Canada isn't going to publish that to the public.
Yeah. So what I want people to take from this is that, though it might seem like we're jumping all over the place, and in some ways that's just how our brain works, but these issues are really connected. Placement is connected to the issue of ID cards, which is connected to the issue of violence, which is connected to the fact that we don't have good data.
Which is connected to the gender binary.
And why don't we have good data? What is a prison trying to do on some level?
Right. I think that's a big theme, right? Because overall, research has shown that the goal of Corrections Canada, the goal of the prison system in Canada as an institution, is more focused on the concept of public safety or segregation than it is about rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be a little bit of a misnomer, because there's this idea that if we take everybody that's violent or otherwise complex and institutionalize them, that everything's fine. But
Yeah.
but really what happens is people go to prisons and have very traumatic experiences in them and don't have a lot of like rehabilitation supports. I mean, what I would think is like what you would want,
Mm-hmm.
and it's such a difficult and politicized topic, is that you would want somebody who is causing harm in society to receive adequate rehabilitation supports so that they would no longer cause harm.
Or that there's stuff being done to address the harm that they've caused.
Right.
Like maybe paying for damages, all those kinds of things.
And what we see in practice is an over-criminalization of people in poverty who have minor offenses, drug-related offenses, minor, like, petty crimes, like shoplifting.
Or also, like, increasingly with trans women and trans women of color, like, sex work, really.
Sex work.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, I mean, what are we achieving by, and how much is it, and even if you want to talk about, like, how much is it costing?
Yeah. It's very expensive.
To house.
To the taxpayer. It's very
to the taxpayer to house so many people, and housing them for so long, because what about reoffending? What about going back into the community and you've not received the adequate mental health supports, the adequate rehabilitation supports to get a good job? Because once you have a criminal record, it is very, very difficult to get a job that isn't trades.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's almost like you have to become like a forklift driver. You have to...
Or what people do is they get in the underground economies.
The underground economies, exactly. I mean, and like, what if you want to have a career? You can't. I mean, even like Amazon requires you to have a criminal record check.
Yeah.
Like, and if you have a criminal record check and it comes up that you have a criminal record, they're just not going to hire you because they have so many candidates. So you're stuck in this cycle of poverty.
And so what I want to sort of hit on around that, and I think people who have encountered this issue before can kind of see where we're leading here, but one thing I really want to reiterate is that the Canadian prison system is not complying with humane practices for trans people, and we're also not abiding by the various international treaties that we've signed. Canada likes to think of itself as a very like human rights oriented, pushing forward internationally, we're the ones going in, the peacekeepers, to try to enforce these like human rights organizations or human rights charters, and then we're not following the ones that we've signed. So according to the International Convent for Civil and Political Rights, all persons deprived of their liberty shall be treated with humanity and respect for the inherent dignity of the human person, and prisons cannot be places of torture. And I think, discussing the lack of dignity in the medical care, the massive risk of violence, we can see that that's not being followed. The Mandela rules stress that prison rules are to be applied impartially. There should be no discrimination on the grounds of sex and other status. We can see that that's not happening here.
No.
And according to the UN Rights for Indigenous Peoples, states must provide effective mechanisms for prevention and redress for any action that has the aim or effect of depriving Indigenous persons of their integrity and distinct peoples or their cultural values and ethnic identities. Governments are to take particular care to protect Indigenous prisoners who identify as trans and two-spirits and whose identities linked to their Indigenous cultural practices. So again, that's just not happening. So again, we have this situation where healthcare is not being met. There's this huge use of solitary. CSC is making claims that they're not actually following, claiming that they have policies, programs, and practices to respect gender, ethnic, cultural, linguistic differences, and to be responsive to the needs of women, Aboriginal peoples, persons requirement of mental health care, and other groups. And this isn't happening.
And I want to stress that this is, happening at every level, but a lot of this is happening at a macro level with the policies, right? That could be changed and could have ripple effects on the micro level.
So on a policy level, if we're going to shoot for the moon for a second, I think people who have encountered this issue and encountered carceral issues before really see abolition as the solution. So abolition, according to Bain Goldberg, is a pervasive call for the eradication of carcerality. Abolition and queerness exist in harmony since they are both political postures subversive of normativity, hegemony, and power. The fundamental function of carceral institution is containment and elimination. So we can do our best to change them. I mean, there's been often of like trans-normative prisons where we create prisons just for trans people and that'll solve the placement issues. It's not like, it's just not gonna, it's gonna reproduce the same harms that we're seeing. Overcrowding is being remedied by building more prisons. It is becoming easier to send an individual to prison than using alternatives or less expensive means. So that
when you think about like how expensive is it to be, like I mentioned earlier, to be housing people, like housing so many people in prisons, that our prisons are becoming overcrowded, but then also like so many of the people in prisons like that are overrepresented groups are like LGBTQ groups, like like low income groups, racialized groups, right? How much would it cost to instead put programming in place to support these communities?
And to take a restorative justice perspective for a second, which often comes from Indigenous communities, the Six Nations of the Grand River attempted a restorative alternative justice system, and there was an issue where one of the persons who went through that system was engaging in recidivism and committed another crime, and that was seen as a moment where the federal government said, okay, we tried it your way and it didn't work. And they responded to, we've been trying it your way for hundreds of years and it isn't working. Yeah. So there's just this like lack of investment in alternative solutions, even though when you actually look at the data, there are lower rates of recidivism and it is quite less expensive.
And how much are we spending on policing as well, right? When we could be putting money into these social programs that prevent crime and prevent recidivism.
And that's interesting to me, that Julia Sudbury article, which I found really helpful, really linked the reason we call it abolition is to link it to like the abolition of slavery and that as a successful movement, and the way in which prisons seek to regulate gender, they seek to regulate racial minorities, they seek to regulate people who are in any way, like you said, quote unquote difficult, have behaviors we don't want to deal with. So in prison is this sort of modern day manifestation of these massive oppressive structures.
But it also creates people that are more complex and have more complex needs, and because they're more traumatized, they've gone through the system, they're institutionalized, and they become entrenched in these systems.
And one thing I joked when we started that we're sort of shooting for the moon, but I think the abolition of prisons is possible, and I think recognizing that it's possible allows us to really advance mental health care that is grounded in principles of recovery, reducing segregation, reducing seclusion and restraint.
And I think people think about abolition and they think, oh, you're just gonna shut down the prisons and let everyone go free. And it's like, that's not what I would hope would be the case. I would hope that there would be alternatives in place to support people with reintegration, and also to first just start by not over-policing communities that have been over-policed historically and over-policing lower-income communities. That's what it comes down to, I think. A lot of people that I've encountered that have been involved in the criminal justice system are being over-policed because of their lower socioeconomic status and because of the communities that they live in geographically.
And I think we also need to think of the ways in which abolition exists in sort of a relationship with micropractice. So better federal policies would strengthen mental health across the continuum of justice involvement. So starting with, in communities. Reforms to existing legislation that includes greater funding, training, more diversified access to mental health supports, again, in your communities, not just in prisons. Further support addressing the social determinants of health for people who are justice involved, so that, again, links to the poverty that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of ties into, at a micro level, what can we really do as practitioners in the community, as like workers, as peers in the community. And I think that especially when it comes to, prisons is such a big issue, but if we're going to just talk about gender diversity and LGBTQ issues and that intersection with the criminal justice system, I think that it's really important for workers and peers to educate ourselves about LGBTQ issues. And I mean that in a very practical sense, right? Obviously a lot of people, probably if you're a social work student and you're listening to this podcast, you already know to respect someone's chosen pronouns and respect their chosen name and not to use their dead name. These are some of the basics, right? But I think that there's a lack of understanding from workers and just people in the community in general about what does being trans look like? What does that look like, right? And what does being gender diverse look like? What does it mean to be intersex? Educating yourself about how transitions work in practice. How this plays out as a worker and as a peer is if you understand how these systems that maybe are not affecting you personally, but might affect people you know or might affect people you've come in contact with, you can make their lives easier because they don't have to educate you. They don't have to, you're not making their life more difficult by being, even though you have great intentions and working with them, you don't know what challenges they're dealing with. Whereas if you understand, for instance, what it looks like to have a bottom surgery, what that process means, how many months do people have to spend recovering from a bottom surgery, not expecting your client to go for a walk with you right after they've had a major invasive surgery, providing adequate accommodations so that they can, for instance, if somebody is having a vaginoplasty, they may need a bathtub or they may need to dilate, and making sure that they have access to those is a big thing. And even just having access to clean water, if you're a trans individual and you're dealing with different intersections such as, low socioeconomic status, maybe you're living on reserve even, right? What if you don't have access to clean water?
And I just want to pull together a little bit what we've been discussing. So on what you can do is advocate for abolition. On a micro level, a lot of self-education. On sort of a meso level, talking to your representatives about the decision for transition-related care to be taken out of CSC's hands, put through a program outside of the reach, something in the community. The overriding health and safety concern clause needs to be dropped from policy. And what I would like for us to end with is a couple of people's stories. Because again, I think we need to be recognizing that these are real people's lives. So, I want to say too that sometimes we forget that this is very real. This is affecting real people every day. And I think that not to over politicize it or sensationalize it or minimize it, and realize that these are real situations that people encounter today and have encountered. And some of these people have used pseudonyms to protect their identities. So Boyd Kodak was a trans man who was arrested for harassment in 2012. He was held in the female holding cells at the station. He was transferred to the Vanier Center for Women, where he was strip searched again. His penile prosthesis was removed by prison officers despite his protests. He recounted horrifying tales of insults and other forms of abuse while in holding. The Crown dropped the charges, and he was released. He still suffers from depression and anxiety and is being treated for post-traumatic stress or disorder as a result of what happened to him. Bakari is a pseudonym for a non-binary person who was incarcerated in both Canada and California. He states, you have male and female prisons. I'm not male or female, so which one do I go to? You're housed according to your genitalia, which to me does not connote gender. At CIW, when I first got there, I had on boxers. They took them. They said they were contraband. They make you wear panties and a muumuu, an old lady house dress. When new people come in, all the women stand there to see if it's their friends walking in, and you are humiliating walking by in this muumuu. Nicholas at Port Cartier Institution in northern Quebec. Guards twisted Nicholas DiNardo's arm behind their back with such force that they broke it, an incident that even the CSC recognizes was excessive. Megan, again a pseudonym, knew she was a woman when she was 10. She was incarcerated at 21 years old. She knew that it was not a space to come out. Other trans women experienced in the system experienced things that she saw. The most horrible abuse, not only from their fellow inmates, from their staff. That pushed me in the closet even further. In 2018, she came out to her case management team as gender neutral. Most of the staff didn't know what the hell to do with me. There were questions about why she was only coming out now and how this was going to relate to risk management. A few months later, she started identifying as a woman and came out to others housed in the men's institution. Almost from day one, I had to start filing complaints to get my basic needs met. Staff made no effort to use her correct pronouns or respect the individualized search protocols that were created for her. After fighting CSC for over a year, she received breast augmentation. Her augmented breast triggered a lot of unwanted attention. One of her fellow inmates physically assaulted her. CSC kept him in her unit. And so thank you so much for listening, and I encourage you to keep these people's stories in mind as you work towards improving your communities and the treatment of trans people in your communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and continue to reflect on how you can be a better ally to trans people and continue learning